The 1st of January, Part 8 of Mr. Pickwick's Christmas, and the second part of the Goblin story. Gabriel Grubb was paralysed and could make no reply. "What do you do here on Christmas Eve?" said the Goblin sternly. "I came to dig a grave, sir," stammered Gabriel Grubb. "What man wanders among graves and churchyards on such a night as this?" cried the Goblin. "Gabriel Grubb! Gabriel Grubb!" screamed a wild chorus of voices that seemed to fill the churchyard. Gabriel looked fearfully round. Nothing was to be seen. "What have you got in that bottle?" said the Goblin. "Hollands, sir," replied the sexton, trembling more than ever, for he had bought it off the smugglers, and he thought that perhaps his questioner might be in the excise department of the Goblins. "Who drinks Hollands alone and in a churchyard on such a night as this?" said the Goblin. "Gabriel Grubb! Gabriel Grubb!" exclaimed the wild voices again. The Goblin leered maliciously at the terrified sexton, and then, raising his voice, exclaimed, "And who, then, is our fair and lawful prize?" To this inquiry, the invisible chorus replied, in a strain that sounded like the voices of many choristers singing to the mighty swell of the old church organ, a strain that seemed borne to the sexton's ears upon a wild wind, and to die away as it passed onwards. But the burden of the reply was still the same: "Gabriel Grubb! Gabriel Grubb!" The Goblin grinned a broader grin than before, and he said, "Well, Gabriel, what do you say to this?" The sexton gasped for breath. "What do you think of this, Gabriel?" said the Goblin, kicking up his feet in the air on either side of the tombstone, and looking at the turned-up points with as much complacency as if he had been contemplating the most fashionable pair of Wellingtons in all Bond Street. It's very curious, sir," replied the sexton, half dead with fright. "Very curious, sir, and very pretty, but I think I'll go back and finish my work, sir, if you please." "Work?" said the Goblin. "What work?" "The grave, sir, making the grave," stammered the sexton. "Oh, the grave, eh?" said the Goblin. "Who makes graves at a time when all other men are merry, and take their pleasure in it?" Again the mysterious voices replied, "Gabriel Grubb! Gabriel Grubb!" "I'm afraid my friends want you, Gabriel," said the Goblin, thrusting his tongue further into his cheek than ever, and a most astonishing tongue it was too. "I'm afraid my friends want you, Gabriel," said the Goblin. "On favour, sir," replied the horror-stricken sexton. "I don't think they can, sir. They don't know me, sir. I don't think the gentlemen have ever seen me, sir." "Oh, yes, they have," replied the Goblin. "We know the man with the sulky face and grim scowl that came down the street tonight, throwing his evil looks at the children and grasping his burying spade the tighter. We know the man who struck the boy in the envious malice of his heart, because the boy could be merry and he could not. We know him, we know him." Here the Goblin gave a loud, shrill laugh, which the echoes returned 20-fold, and throwing his legs up in the air, stood upon his head, or rather upon the very point of his sugar-loaf hat, on the narrow edge of the tombstone, whence he threw a somerset with extraordinary agility right to the sexton's feet, at which he planted himself in the attitude in which tailors generally sit upon the shop-board. I'm afraid I must leave you, sir," said the sexton, making an effort to move. "Leave us?" said the Goblin. "Gabriel Grubb is going to leave us. Ho, ho, ho!" As the Goblin laughed, the sexton observed for one instant a brilliant illumination within the windows of the church, as if the whole building was lighted up. It disappeared. The organ pealed forth a lively air, and whole troops of goblins, the very counterpart of the first one, poured into the churchyard and began playing at leapfrog with the tombstones, never stopping for an instant to take breath, but overing the highest among them, one after the other, with the most marvellous dexterity. The first goblin was a most astonishing leaper, and none of the others could come near him. Even in the extremity of his terror, the sexton could not help observing that while his friends were content to leap over the common-sized gravestones, the first one took to the family vaults, iron railings and all, with as much ease as if they had been so many street posts. At last the game reached to a most exciting pitch. The organ played quicker and quicker. The goblins leaped faster and faster, coiling themselves up, rolling head over heels upon the ground, and bounding over the tombstones like footballs. The sexton's brain whirled round with the rapidity of the motion he beheld, and his legs reeled beneath him as the spirits flew before his eyes, when the Goblin King, suddenly darting towards him, laid his hand upon his shirt collar and sank with him through the earth. When Gabriel Grubb had had time to fetch his breath, which the rapidity of his descent had for the moment taken away, he found himself in what appeared to be a large cavern, surrounded on all sides by crowds of goblins, ugly and grim. In the centre of the room, on an elevated seat, was stationed his friend of the churchyard, and close behind him stood Gabriel Grubb himself, without power of motion. "Cold tonight," said the king of the goblins. "Very cold. A glass of something warm here." At this command, half a dozen officious goblins, with a perpetual smile upon their faces, whom Gabriel Grubb imagined to be courtiers on that account, hastily disappeared, and presently returned with a goblet of liquid fire, which they presented to the king. "Ah!" cried the goblin, whose cheeks and throat were transparent as he tossed down the flame. "This warms one indeed. Bring a bumper of the same for Mr. Grubb." It was in vain for the unfortunate sexton to protest that he was not in the habit of taking anything warm at night. One of the goblins held him, while another poured the blazing liquid down his throat. The whole assembly screeched with laughter as he coughed and choked, and wiped away the tears which gushed plentifully from his eyes after swallowing the burning draught. "And now," said the king, fantastically poking the taper corner of his sugarloaf hat into the sexton's eye, and thereby occasioning him the most exquisite pain, "and now show the man of misery and gloom a few of the pictures from our own great storehouse." As the goblin said this, a thick cloud which obscured the remoter end of the cavern rolled gradually away, and disclosed, apparently at a great distance, a small and scantily furnished, but neat and clean apartment. A crowd of little children were gathered around a bright fire, clinging to their mother's gown and gambolling around her chair. The mother occasionally rose, and drew aside the window curtain as if to look for some expected object. A frugal meal was ready spread upon the table, and an elbow chair was placed near the fire. A knock was heard at the door. The mother opened it, and the children crowded around her, and clapped their hands for joy as their father entered. He was wet and weary, and shook the snow from his garments as the children crowded round him, and seizing his cloak, hat, stick, and gloves with busy zeal, ran with them from the room. Then, as he sat down to his meal before the fire, the children climbed about his knee, and the mother sat by his side, and all seemed happiness and comfort. But a change came upon the view, almost imperceptibly. The scene was altered to a small bedroom, where the fairest and youngest child lay dying. The roses had fled from his cheek, and the light from his eye, and even as the sexton looked upon him with an interest he had never felt or known before, he died. His young brothers and sisters crowded around his little bed, and seized his tiny hand, so cold and heavy, but they shrank back from its touch, and looked with awe on his infant face, for calm and tranquil as he was, and sleeping in rest and peace as the beautiful child seemed to be, they saw that he was dead, and they knew that he was an angel looking down upon and blessing them from a bright and happy heaven. Again the light cloud passed across the picture, and again the subject changed. The father and mother were old and helpless now, and the number of those about them was diminished more than half. But content and cheerfulness sat on every face, and beamed in every eye as they crowded around the fireside, and told and listened to old stories of earlier and bygone days. Slowly and peacefully the father sank into the grave. and soon after the sharer of all his cares and troubles followed him to a place of rest. The few who yet survived them kneeled by their tomb and watered the green turf which covered it with their tears, then rose and turned away sadly and mournfully, but not with bitter cries or despairing lamentations, for they knew that they should one day meet again, and once more they mixed with the busy world, and their content and cheerfulness was restored. The cloud settled upon the picture and concealed it from the sexton's view. That's the end of the second part of the Goblin story. We'll have the third part tomorrow. Bye now.